number one topic. We wanted to speak with Dr. Raywat Deonandan joining us today. How are you, Doctor?
I'm well. How are you?
Thank you so much for joining us, epidemiologist with U Ottawa. And Doctor, we know there's so many different facets to vaccines. Let's first start off with vaccines for the little ones, 5 to 11-year-olds. How are you feeling about this happening in this country?
Well, it has to be offered. I think there's no way around that. A lot of parents want it. I would certainly want it for my child. I would estimate between 50 and 75% of parents would take it right away for their kids. The question becomes, should it be mandatory? I think it will be in a year or so. It'll be one of the 9 or 10 mandatory vaccines to attend schools. I'm not on board with making it mandatory right now, though. I think we have a lot of public education, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of having to manage people's concerns first. And I think we can get around having to make it mandatory because a majority of people will want it voluntarily.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. For all the other vaccines that our children get, because exactly what you said, to get to school, they need to have these vaccines. Was the same challenge there for, let's say, the chickenpox vaccine or any of the other vaccines that are given to children?
It's a good question. I don't really know the history of it that much. I think every generation has had some pushback against it. Before COVID, there was a strong anti-vax movement. We have outbreaks of measles and chickenpox and other vaccine-preventable diseases in places in the Western world where that anti-vax sentiment does rise up. But it's never been at this fevered pitch before, probably because we have such an incredible laser focus on these vaccines, probably undeservedly so. We have to think back at what life was like before vaccination to see what a horrible existence that was.
Well, and let's be honest, in other parts of the world, some of the things we're vaccinated for in this country are still happening and people are dying from those diseases.
Exactly right. One way to think about world history is in 3 phases. This is called the epidemiologic transition. The first phase is the age of pandemics. That's when people died of diseases all the time. The second phase was the age of receding pandemics. That's when we had vaccination and clean water and we started getting more kids being born and living. And now we have the age of degenerative man-made diseases. So obesity, diabetes, and cancers are major killers. But that's because people weren't dying of obesity and diabetes and cancer because they were dying of these other things that vaccines now prevent. So we don't want to go back to those previous eras where people died en masse of these things we can prevent.
Mm-hmm. I think some of the most heartbreaking moments through this pandemic for me, especially recently, we're seeing a lot of it out of Alberta where people decided not to get vaccinated and then tragically they would end up in ICU, and the last things they were saying to their families before they lost their life to COVID was, please tell everyone to get vaccinated. I had no idea.
Yeah, look, it's akin to lifelong smokers who die horrible deaths of emphysema or lung cancer and then say, I regret having smoked, or drunk drivers who kill people and say, I regret having done that drinking. I knew better and I chose a different path. Regret is great, but regret comes at a price this time around. That price is death very often.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were studying and you were going to school, could you ever imagine in a million years we'd be in this situation, or were we sort of, and this is going to sound awful, but were we sort of primed for a pandemic?
We've been expecting a pandemic for a long time. Many of us, myself included, wrote papers 20 years ago saying we are due for a 1918 style Spanish flu pandemic within the next 10, 20 years. And here we are. It could have been much worse. Frankly, I and others were expecting influenza to be the thing that did this. And as pandemics go, it could, the lethality rate is high, but it could be much worse. Imagine if this were instantaneously airborne. It's airborne right now, but imagine if it was more so. Imagine if the death rate was higher. This would be quite a horrible tragedy. And by the way, we still expect more of them to come. Right? We're maybe re-entering an era of pandemics. We don't know.
Wow, that's scary. You don't often leave me speechless, Doctor, but right there you did.
Well, but there's good news. And the good news is we have technologies, we have protocols, we have perspective to protect us. We got to keep our vaccine manufacturing platforms alive, keep our surveillance systems up and running so we get advanced warning of impending pandemics and can cut them off at the heels, as we do with influenza, by the way.
Right. And I think back to, obviously 1918, obviously the pandemic then, there wasn't the sort of travel we see now as well. That must have been a big factor in COVID.
Absolutely. What we have now is a world teeming with people. We have globalized trade. We have instantaneous travel almost. You can get into an airplane in Tokyo and arrive in New York before the incubation period of a disease is over. That was not the case in 1918. And we are encroaching into parts of the world where humans did not spend a lot of time before and encountering new diseases. We're also living in close proximity with sick animals more so. Think about the wet markets of Asia. And most of the lethal pandemics arise from diseases jumping from animals into humans. So these are things we've got to watch, and this is why we need proper global surveillance to prevent this down the road.
Mm-hmm. And of course, top of mind for so many people right now is the fact that Ontario, the province, isn't going to mandate vaccines for healthcare workers. We know a number of hospitals obviously have done that on their own. When you heard that news, Doctor, what was your reaction?
My eyes rolled so hard they almost popped out of my head. It's such an obvious thing to do, to mandate. If any group is going to be mandated to be vaccinated, it should be healthcare workers, because if for no other reason, the messaging, right? So this is the group that should be most cognizant of the power of vaccination. This is the group that is most at risk for receiving infection because they're treating infected people. So they're the ones who need to be best protected, at the same time showing others that this is what we need to do. So it's disappointing. And I think there's a gamble here that the awesome power of vaccination throughout the rest of society will keep case rates down and not necessitate having to impose it upon healthcare workers unnecessarily. But it's deeply disappointing.
Dr. Deonandan, let me ask you this. When we think about, how far we've all come, and now we're sort of at this point where, we're hoping that the last, depending on where you are, 10% of people become vaccinated. What do you think it would take, to get those people vaccinated? Or do you think they've just made up their minds, dug in their heels, and it's just not going to happen for them?
Well, the last 10-15% are a diverse group. They include people who are religiously inclined to defy vaccination. That's an intractable group. I don't think there are actually that many of them. Then there are those who are hesitant because they do not understand the science and are afraid of some of the scary memes going around on Facebook and Twitter. For them, we just need better public education and access to authority figures that are trustworthy. Then there are those who do not see it as a priority. They're apathetic and trust their natural immune systems on an untoward fashion. For them, that's where the vaccine passports seem to have an effect. Then there are those who want to get vaccinated but can't get away from the home or work because of childcare constraints or distance or things like that. And for them, we need better policy levers, paid sick days, and so forth. There are a variety of tools we can still deploy to cajole and encourage further vaccine uptake.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to healthcare workers, we often hear, and we heard this certainly from the province as well and many others, that if the people that refuse to get vaccinated that are working in healthcare get laid off and we make this a policy, then we will have even a worse shortage than we do now in healthcare workers. What are your thoughts about that, Doctor?
I've heard that argument, but no one's ever shown me any data. Exactly how many people are we talking about here? Is it an appreciable number? I don't think it is. I really don't think it is. So until you show me an actual number, I think this is all just shouting into the wind.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. And when you and your colleagues get together, what is the main concern moving forward as we try to get out of this pandemic?
It's how to rebuild public trust. All right. So what we have is a crisis in trust of authority, trust in government, trust in media, trust in supposed experts. How do we rebuild that? And I think you rebuild it from the ground up with a solid public science education program, not just for kids in school, but for the general population as well. And we got to start doing that right now.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting that you say that. As soon as you talked about sort of educating children, I think, obviously that's an important piece. I think about even smoking or drinking, all of those things that we sort of learned. I think you might remember back. I think I'm a lot older than you, but that lung that they would show in school. The healthy lung and the smoker's lung. That all is part of this, though, right? That we need to ensure kids understand the importance of our health care and really educating them through this process too.
Totally right. The thing about smoking and other kinds of public health crises in the past is we took our time. We had generations to change smoking behavior. We've got months to change this kind of behavior. So it takes more than simply rolling out some demonstration models into elementary school. We need a full court press using the media, using social networks and so forth to have people understand exactly why scientific decisions are made and how to assess both evidence and risk in your personal life.
Excellent point. Doctor, what keeps you up at night?
My crying toddler. That's what keeps me up at
Right.
night. What keeps me up at night really is I wonder, again, how much trust is still salvageable and whether it is possible to repair the divisions in society that weren't caused by this pandemic. They're caused by larger political manifestations, but the pandemic has exacerbated them. And I
Hmm.
wonder, what can I do to help this process, and what is possible in the framework of a liberal democracy where individual freedom means so much. But individual freedom seems to be the thing that drives these divisions more than anything else.
Let me ask you, I know you obviously learned a lot when you went to school to become a doctor. Were these issues of trust and, really the last number of sentences you just shared part of your training as a doctor?
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a PhD. And
Hmm.
in my studies as an epidemiologist, this was part of it in the sense that, exactly how many tools can you deploy in a public health emergency without getting to the War Measures Act? And this was something that was discussed peripherally, but never at the core of what we studied. And it really needs to be now. When we talk about public health communication, we usually talk about how to explain to people what they need to do to keep themselves safe or to keep them informed. It's never about actively combating disinformation and misinformation. And that's been a good 75% of my role this past year. And no one has trained me or others for this kind of information warfare, which is what it comes down to, frankly. And we have to pivot and reassess how we do public health from this point on.
Fascinating. I always learn something when I spend time with you, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time today. I know how busy you are.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raywat Deonandan from U Ottawa.